Hello, my name is Ben Weston, and I'm an associate professor at the Medical College of Wisconsin and the director of medical services at the Milwaukee County Office of Emergency Management. I'm going to spend a few minutes in this video outlining the concept of the SAFER model, which stands for Strategic Allocation of Fundamental Epidemic Resources. In this short presentation, I will briefly discuss the challenges in measuring the disease burden of COVID-19 or any sort of epidemic and pandemic, and then I will introduce and discuss the SAFER model, outline applications of the model that have taken place in Milwaukee County, and finally detail some next steps. When we think of COVID-19 or any sort of epidemic or pandemic, or really any sort of disease state, it's important to understand the disease burden in the community, and specifically subsections of a given community. This is really the purpose of the SAFER model. When thinking of ways to measure disease burden, a variety of approaches are often seen. Raw case numbers are often cited in news articles, but it's hard to interpret the true meaning of those case numbers alone, as the degree of testing taking place can skew known case numbers in one direction or another. Similar challenges are inherent in the reproductive number, which does not take testing rates carefully into account. Hospitalizations and deaths are obviously critical values to understand as they so adversely affect the community. But these are both lagging indicators, and not as useful for real-time resource allocation and disease tracking. Percent positive rates begin to take into account testing, but as you'll see in the coming slides, testing rates must be considered separately to have the best understanding of true disease burden. We can illustrate the importance of percent positive and testing rate with 4 census tracts in Milwaukee County, seen here at one point in the pandemic. The blue community has 0 positive cases, but only 12 tests have been performed in that community. It's very difficult to definitively say what is happening in that specific census tract. Similarly, the green community has a 0% positivity, but 114 tests have been performed in that tract, more indicative of a true low disease state. Moving to the red community, we see that 25% of tests are coming back positive, and many tests have been performed, indicating a very high disease burden in that community. This is in contrast to the yellow community, where the percent positive is still high, but not as many tests have been performed. This is a concerning community, where not enough individuals may be getting tested, and an underlying higher disease burden may be present. While each of these examples illustrate the concept of combining percent positive and testing numbers, of course the testing rate is what must be taken into account to really understand how each census tract or community compares to the next. This leads us to the basic structure of the SAFER model. It's a simple 4-quadrant design. Testing rate increases on the y-axis on the left, and positivity rate increases on the x-axis on the bottom. The blue, green, red, and yellow boxes are labeled by indications of disease activity, including undetermined, lowest, highest, and concerning. And here you can see how these quadrants relate to our 4 example census tracts from the previous slide. The blue census tract has a low percent positivity and a low testing rate. This is an undetermined disease activity, as we really don't have enough information to understand the dynamics in this census tract. The green census tract has a low percent positivity but a high testing rate. These would be the census tracts of lowest disease activity. The red census tracts have a high percent positivity and a high testing rate. This is an area of highest disease activity, as we know that there's plenty of testing going on and a lot of disease present. The yellow census tract has a similarly high percent positivity, but a low testing rate. This is an area of concerning disease activity, as many individuals likely have the disease, but are not getting tested. This 4-quadrant design is fleshed out here in the full SAFER model. Feel free to hit pause and review the details. Each quadrant has a summary of the meaning of the color, a description of how testing should be approached for that community, a consideration for resource allocation in the community, and areas of focus for messaging based on quadrant classification. Focusing on one quadrant for illustration purposes, with a yellow community, you have concerning disease activity with few people getting tested, but a concerning number of cases with high positivity rates. In this community, you'd want to increase testing aggressively. From a resource perspective, one would want to facilitate testing, intensely monitor disease burden on a regular basis, as it is likely to become much more evident with increased testing, and understand the equity-related reasons for low testing and high positivity. For the public messaging, here you'd want to strongly encourage individuals to get tested and voice the reasons for the under-testing concern. You can also see from the dotted lines suggested shifting of resources and shifting of testing between quadrant communities with an understanding of finite resources. You would want to shift resources from your lowest disease activities communities to your highest disease activity community. Likewise, you'd want to shift testing from your lowest disease activity or green community to your concerning disease activity or yellow community. Finally, a few key points and assumptions are outlined to the right. Getting into a few of the details about the SAFER model, there are 3 defined methods of stratification or the creation of cut points for the X and Y axis. That is to say, how you decide to separate out the low versus high testing rates and the low versus high positivity rates. These include median value classification, cluster-based classification, and goal-oriented classification. Each of these 3 classifications are shown here. Median value classification simply takes the median value of all the census tracts and artificially forces the tracts evenly into the 4 quadrants. This is useful for forcing comparisons between census tracts to understand and inform resource and testing distribution. The cluster-based classification in the center uses statistical modeling through the Jenks natural breaks optimization, which essentially clusters the census tracts into similar type of groups. While this still forces the census tracts into the 4 quadrants, it does it in a more natural manner, accounting for outliers as well as similar clusters. Like the median value classification, this allows for understanding differences between the census tracts while allowing for more natural distribution in the 4 quadrants. Finally, the goal-oriented model on the right is a bit different. The breakpoints for the quadrants are strictly set and static, based on goals in the community. Positivity, for example, can be set at 5% and does not change over time. This allows for better understanding as to which communities are achieving preset goals and which need further support. Here you can see a snapshot in time of where Milwaukee stood at one point in the pandemic, based on 3 stratifications. Median value on the left allowed for the most variance and clearly outlined communities in need of testing and resource shifting. The cluster-based classification in the middle still outlined the communities in need, but also showed that the majority of the county clustered in the blue zone. Finally, the goal-oriented view on the right showed that testing was a key area of need in the community and how to prioritize that, with almost all census tracts falling into the blue or yellow categories. Finally, you can see how we've used this model in Milwaukee County to see how census tracts are changing over time. Each of the views here show a 3-week time period and the changes that have occurred. In the county, we use this modeling for testing location determination, resource allocation, including isolation and quarantine housing, as well as mass distribution programs, and for targeted messaging, through both informing the community of areas of concern, as well as using local media and community leaders in specific identified areas to assist in getting the message disseminated. By viewing the change in the model over time, we can see the effects that we have had and adjust accordingly. There are many next steps for this model, but here are a few. Certainly, continued integration into the community is important. One of the pleasures of developing and disseminating this model has been seeing the ways that it has been implemented and utilized in community programming and interventions beyond what we anticipated and designed it for, from determining areas to focus quarantine resources to informing school reopening planning. Further validation of the model and its ability to inform resource allocation will be helpful to better understand limitations and opportunities for future use. And certainly, we hope that future use of the model can extend beyond simply census tracts, whether that is broader geographic use such as counties or states, or getting beyond geography to understand differences in disease among racial and ethnic groups, age clustering, living situations, and more. I appreciate your time, and I would like to acknowledge a few folks from the Milwaukee County Office of Emergency Management who helped in the development and implementation of this model. Zach Swingen is our GIS specialist. Shannon Grauman is our data and analytics manager. And Dan Pojar is our EMS division director. If you have any thoughts or questions about the SAFER model, I'd love to hear from you, and my email is below. And please check out our publication on the SAFER model in the Journal of Public Health. Thank you, and stay safe.